My assignment for this event is to talk about story in business. And I'm delighted to do that because, as Gabriel's introduction will have suggested, I've been teaching at a business school for the past almost, I guess it's 20 years now, and have thought a lot about the connection between story and storytelling and the way we do business, the way we think about management. I would also say, having listened to Jackie talk for the past half hour, 45 minutes about listening, that I too believe deeply in the importance of listening. And if I were to do this event now, the way I preferred, I would listen. I would ask you the questions, and I would listen to you give me the answers. That's not the way these keynotes are set up. So I will talk for roughly half an hour and hope that once I have done that, and because we have these long coffee breaks and a long lunch hour, et cetera, that we will have an opportunity then for conversation. So, I'm going to proceed according to the agenda you see on the screen. First, the challenge, that is, what does it mean to lead, to go back to the title of my talk, Leading Through Story. So what is the challenge here in leadership? And offer you a narrative that will set forth some of the considerations that go into using story in leadership. And then I'll talk about the solution, which is, no surprise given where we are, a story, and how we use story to lead and lead effectively, specifically in business. But you will see as I go through my talk that I am convinced leadership in business cannot happen effectively if you do not consider what leadership in any other sector might look like. In other words, if you think about the world, and I realize this is a simplification, but if you think about the world as divided into public sector, private sector, and civil society, I don't think, and here I note Jackie's reference to the CEO side by side with the rapist. This is not a route I would prefer to go, right? But nevertheless, here we are. But that if you want to lead successfully in business, you have to recognize what it means to lead in the public sector, what it means to lead in civil society. And I would say the same for the other areas. You want to be a public official, figure out what's going on in the private sector, figure out what it means to be part of civil society. I'll develop that as we proceed through this talk. And then finally, after offering a solution, I hope to talk a bit about business stories to honor my piece of this contract, such as it is, and talk to you, and I think some of you are indeed business people. There are entrepreneurs in the audience, I know, to talk about the stories we use to talk about business and the stories we might use more frequently to do the same and do it more effectively. So first, I'm going to put one of my hosts on the spot here right at the beginning, and I have put on the screen before you a quote from an issue of DOR 2011-2012, and this is Christian Lupsha. Romania has always harbored interesting contrasts. Nobody, from the tourism ministry to ad agencies, can agree on a strategy for nation branding, but we all agree and embrace the idea of contrasts. Now, my guess is that when Christian wrote this 2-3 years ago, he did not anticipate having someone come in and comment on the business content of this statement, but it's there and it's real. Do we want to think of Romania, and I know many of you are Romanian, do you want to think of your country as an entity that needs branding? Do you want to think of yourselves as a product, something that could be put on the world market and presented for consumption? At some level, my guess is yes, because it does involve economics, and economics is key to survival of just about any entity we know. So there is an immediate relevance here, a connection between what I do and what Christian is proposing here. Yes, it's ad agencies. Yes, it's the tourism industry. Yes, it's travel agents. You can establish the list of people who have a stake in looking at Romania as an economic project. But there is this other piece, of course, the natural resources you have, the cultural history you've got, all of this, which is wealth, but maybe in some cases less obviously tangible than what underlies the term branding. There's another piece to this that is very important, and that is, it's implicit, but it is nevertheless here, the idea of leadership. That is, I read this, and frankly, I read the mission of the magazine, which you all put together and launch on a routine basis, the mission to identify, to find out who will lead, who will make it possible for Romania to live up to what at least the team for Decad o Revista believes is a worthy undertaking. Right? So who will take charge? Recognizing that taking charge, that people have taken charge in this country in the past, and not just in Romania. We have the top-down command and control model of leadership. I don't think that's what we want here. And my guess is that the invitation to Jackie and others in this room point to a different kind of leadership, and I hope we can talk about that as we move forward in the course of these 2 days. So, looking at just this passage, right, the notion of the market, the notion of a business engagement, but in the name of building, and this is a key concept, I think, when we talk about leadership, the good society. We all want to live in a good society, even if it is the good society that allows us to live by ourselves and do exactly what we want, because for libertarians, that's the good society, as little society as possible and as much of me as possible, right? But it's the same principle, and that's what we're working with here. So, that's the challenge. I'm going to offer you an American counterpart to this as a way of illustrating some of the mechanisms that go into this concept and where we might take it. And I start with, so this is sorry, I guess I was one slide behind myself, but here is the quote from Christian, and now the U.S. business narrative that begins in 1925. So I'm going to build an arc for you, and I recognize right up front that this is very selective, but I'm going to offer you 5 quotes, all of which have registered deeply in the American psyche over the past roughly 100 years, and all of which have to do with business or come from the business sector. So this first one, after all, the chief business of the American people is business. This is a stereotype of the United States that we have lived with at least since it was uttered by Calvin Coolidge, 30th President of the United States. And by the way, for the journalists in the room, and I understand there are a lot of you, he was speaking, and the footnote says it, it was an address to the American Society of Newspaper Editors. And Coolidge was concerned with, and like every journalist in this room, with the divide between the editorial and the business sides of the newspaper business. The quote will suggest to you, and I say this with apologies to my journalistic colleagues in the room, that it really is all about business. And that the saving grace for Coolidge here is that Americans are idealists, and therefore our idealism would outweigh our interest in lucre, so wealth and wealth generation, and that we should recognize that newspapers and the media generally are a business and entitled to make a profit and focused on making a profit, and if we did it right, we would not lose the commitment to truth and accurate reporting. But he does fall on the business side of the wall. I don't think there's any question about that. So, starting here, and recognize too that Coolidge is talking out of already, and for those of you who know American history, the progressive backlash against big business. You think of Teddy Roosevelt and everything that he did for the country on the positive side to try to free us from the kinds of inequalities that we are now experiencing again, and I think Jackie captured that. But he also makes this comment, pro-business, 4 years before the Great Depression, which of course has its roots in the business community. So there's a kind of irony there. All right, fast forward 25 years. Charles Irwin Wilson, then the CEO of General Motors. For years, I thought what was good for the country was good for General Motors and vice versa. Again, a sentence that has been handed down across the generations to explain both what is good and what is bad about the United States. There's pretty ample evidence that Wilson was misquoted, and because the popular version of this is what's good for General Motors is good for America. And so, I mean, you see where we go with that. This, of course, again, so this is 1953, 5 years, 7 years, 8 years after the end of World War II, an engagement in which General Motors was, I think, substantially involved, and where it did very well for itself, but of course also for the American people. Wilson said this line during confirmation hearings for his appointment as Secretary of Defense. And as with the Coolidge quote, there is an irony here. So Wilson comes in as Secretary of Defense under Dwight Eisenhower. You were president for 2 terms. And it's Eisenhower who, at the end of his second term, 1961, his farewell speech, warns the American people about the dangers of the military or the growth of a military-industrial complex. So appointing the CEO of General Motors to be Secretary of Defense at the beginning of his 2 terms, and then warning the American people about the military-industrial complex at the end. I don't know the Eisenhower story very well, but I'm always struck by what seems to be a breadth of knowledge and wisdom in this man, who also Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, that staged the Normandy invasion, someone who understood the military in depth, but also appears to have understood the challenge that presents as a piece of our society. Fast forward again, so roughly 20 years, the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. Milton Friedman, Chicago School, the foundation stone for much of what we've seen in this country, so that country, the United States, over the past 40 years, a commitment to the bottom line, and something that we have. So again, the popular phrase for what Friedman says here is maximizing shareholder value. That is, the primary stakeholder, and I use the term advisedly, the primary stakeholder in American business, in any business undertaking, is the shareholder. So it's not about the community, it's not about the employees, it's not about the customers, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, and here again, sort of the backstory, that Friedman does believe he is taking a principled position. And that when he recommends this view of the world and this notion of how society functions, he also believes this is not a case of, on the one hand, money, and on the other hand, values, morals, or ethics, to use a term that Jackie introduced into the conversation earlier. For him, this is a statement of values. It is a position taken on the way the world works and the way the world should work. This is his notion of the good society. And it has put us on a course that I think for much of the business community has seemed profitable over the past 30, 40 years, but we are again beginning to have doubts. You see more and more, to this question of maximizing shareholder value, a sudden recognition that indeed there is no legal obligation to maximize shareholder value, that corporations can have a wide range of purposes so long as they are clear about what they are doing, and that business judgment makes a difference. And the next of our 5 quotes, I think, takes us there. So this is Steve Jobs, right? Stay hungry, stay foolish. One of his leadership principles, a dozen or so of them, that included others that will sound somewhat hard-edged if we go through them. Now is not the time. Note that Jobs is quoting here Stewart Brand, the man who created the Whole Earth catalog, and is very much a part of the counterculture. There's a book by one of my colleagues, Fred Turner, called From Counterculture to Cyberculture. And the transition from Stewart Brand, Stay Hungry, Stay Foolish, on the back cover of the Whole Earth Catalog, 1974, to Steve Jobs' commencement address, Stanford University, 2005, represents that transition from a very different way of seeing the world in the 70s. So this is right. Brand says, stay hungry, stay foolish, and puts out the Whole Earth Catalog just as Friedman is saying, maximize shareholder value. So we've got these 2 somewhat contradictory trends in American culture simultaneously that then come to fruition, I would argue, with Jobs in 2005, recognizing, and there are any number of Apple products in this room right now, that Apple has done extremely well for itself by the design and production sometimes under unfortunate conditions, of the products that we have all learned to love and use effectively. And then the last of these quotes, so this is 2013, and I didn't put the quotable quote on the screen because it may not of itself be clear, but the quote is, "Lean in." And the line behind that quote is what we've got here on the screen. So this is Sheryl Sandberg, the Chief Operating Officer at Facebook, in her book, Lean In, Women, Work, and the Will to Lead. A truly equal world would be one where women ran half our countries and companies and men half our homes. This would have been a much more difficult statement to make, I think, in 1925 when Calvin Coolidge said, after all, the chief business of America is business. And so in that sense, to have Sandberg say what she said when she said it is a measure of how far we have come. So if we're talking about the kind of national enterprise or national project that I think Christian's quote suggests, when we look at the United States, and we look just in the business sector at this progression, I think we realize the possibilities. Also recognize that women are still making, 79 cents on the dollar to what men make in the United States, where we theoretically are somewhat enlightened on these topics. So the progress, if as such as it is, has been slow. And yet, we have the narrative. And with that narrative, we can start to talk about the kinds of improvements that I think we would all like to see in our individual societies and build something that works for more people, that is more inclusive and more egalitarian, even as it recognizes the freedom we believe we need in order to do what we want to do most. So that's stage one, the challenge, and now the solution and a story. So I would argue, and I am not alone in this, so this is not something that I made up, that in order to lead effectively in business, and again, I would argue this applies to the other sectors as well, you need to think about three things simultaneously. One, personal and professional values, that is who you are as a person, but also who you are as an employee or an employer. That is what your values are, what drives you. You also need to think about organizational codes, the places you work, whether it's a newspaper or a startup or IBM or Goldman Sachs, pick your organization. But to understand the values that drive those organizations. And finally, sustainable systems, that is operating premises. The easy way to think about this is to say, on the one hand, capitalism, on the other hand, communism. Or a mixed economy, as some of the Western European nations have practiced over the years. But behind that, I would say there's also something else. And again, Jackie alluded to this. That is what we think of as nature. That is the way we think the world works, and we invariably default to this idea of nature as the place where we go to explain what we otherwise can't explain. And more often than not, assume that that place, wherever it is something over which we have no control. And my argument here would be, we have control. We only have to understand what we're trying to control. And maybe listening is the way to do it. But we need to think about the background to the decisions we make as individuals and in organizations in order to come to a meaningful basis on which to change the things we don't like. So 3 levels: personal and professional values, organizational codes, and sustainable systems, and then double that up with something that I've already alluded to. That is, that we need to think across the sectors in order to understand fully what it means to engage in social change. Private sector leadership, that is how we sustain ourselves economically. Public sector leadership, how we govern ourselves. And civil sector leadership, which is how we, and I use the phrase here, how we recreate ourselves. You could argue, and I would certainly be eager to hear you say this, that we can recreate ourselves through private sector activity, through public sector activity, undertaken with full knowledge of what we're doing and with good intent. The intent, of course, is an issue. Where does this take us? And here I'm going to offer you the story that I think explains the logic of this system. And indeed, it's this story that generated for me the first version, and that is the three levels. This private sector, public sector, civil sector, again, is not me although I have found it very useful. But you go, so for those of you who are engaged in consulting or have had consultants work for you, McKinsey, one of the major consultancies globally, commits to this trio of levels of engagement. When they talk about leadership, this is what they talk about. And there are other entities. There's something called Intersector Project that makes the same case for cross-sector or tri-sector leadership. But the case that for me makes all of this cohere is the case of Rwanda and the genocide of 1994. So I don't know how many of you have seen the film Hotel Rwanda, but Paul Rusesabagina, whom I quote here, is the protagonist of that film. So a business person who, during the course of the genocide, by dint of relying on resources that he had and many other people did not, saved 1,268 Tutsi and moderate Hutu who had come to stay in the hotel of which he was a manager. It's a very powerful film. There have been some, and so I think here again about Jackie's reference to the sometimes partial truths that journalists tell. As with many films based on real-life events, there are some deviations from the exact truth. But the film, I think, fundamentally captures the spirit in which Rusesabagina did what he did. And the autobiography that he wrote that backs up this film makes the same point. So this line comes from the autobiography: "The true state of human affairs is life as it ought to be lived." Why this quote? First of all, it's an echo of C.S. Lewis, the British writer, a deeply religious man, and I think there is a strong religious component to what Rusesabagina is doing here as well. But recognize that he is arguing for the importance of, the necessity of imagining the world we would want to live in, and saying not that that is something we can get to periodically when we have enough to eat and things are relatively peaceful, but this is the default state of being. The true state of human affairs is life as it ought to be lived. So how does this play out in his story, in his piece of the genocide? First line of the autobiography: "My name is Paul Rusesabagina. I am a hotel manager." So this puts us squarely in the realm of business and business undertakings. This is a man in what we refer to as the hospitality industry, right? And some of you in the room may be doing this. For him, that's what drove him, at least as the autobiography tells it, and frankly as the film tells it, and he was a consultant on the film, that it was his training as a hotel manager, as someone in the hospitality business, that made it possible for him to do what he did. He also had the material advantage of access to a hotel that was regarded as a node of elite life in Kigali, so the capital of Rwanda. So he had resources. He had a hotel safe, full of money that he could use to bribe the people who were threatening to kill the 1,268 refugees in the hotel. But I think, too, for him, this is about a spiritual orientation and the notion that having prepared for a kind of life, a professional life, that would allow him to offer comfort to people, he simply carried that over to a crisis situation and did for those 1,268 people what he would have done for any guest at any point in peacetime. And so here we see the business roots of his story. It is also possible, of course, that, and by the way, I've taught this film in other environments. I had a seminar in Mexico City 2-3 weeks ago, and one of the participants in the seminar works in the hospitality industry in Mexico, in Cancun. And she said, the last hurricane, the first line of defense, the first line of response to the hurricane and the damage the hurricane caused came from the people who worked in the hotels. Same impulse. This, of course, raises the question, do you learn to be humane because you work in the hospitality industry, or do you wind up in the hospitality industry because you are fundamentally human and sympathetic to human or humane concerns? I'm not going to try to sort that out here, but because then you have to figure out, all right, so what kind of a person becomes a banker? What kind of a person becomes, right? What kind of a person becomes a journalist? I mean, these are, I say it and you laugh, but these are serious questions, right? So, all right, so anyway, my name is Paul Rusesabagina. I am a hotel manager. That's the personal and professional level that we need to think about when we think about leadership. Next level, Romeo Dallaire. UN force commander in Rwanda during the genocide, Canadian, sent in as the head of the UN peacekeeping force, and wrote a book called Shake Hands with the Devil, The Failure of Humanity in Rwanda. And here's a quote from the book, and this takes us to the organizational of the three levels that I mentioned earlier. Some say that the example of Rwanda proves that the UN is an irrelevant, corrupt, decadent institution that has outlived its usefulness or even its ability to conduct conflict resolution. And indeed, the story of Dallaire, and he's captured in the film Hotel Rwanda as a figure referred to as Colonel Oliver Colonel Oliver, I'm sorry. So he's demoted for the film, but he's still wearing the blue beret. But Dallaire, indeed, during the genocide, found it impossible to get done what he believed needed doing. He was there to keep the peace. He was not a peacemaker, and it's a significant difference for those of you who follow UN engagements. But a peacekeeping force and understood very quickly that it was going to be extremely hard to get not just the UN, but the Western powers to do anything serious about preventing the genocide. So when we talk about organizations here, it's not just the UN, it's also the Clinton administration, and of course Bill Clinton, after the genocide was over, or at least had ended, apologized profoundly for having chosen not to respond to what was happening in Rwanda. And this comes up in one of the films, but Dallaire was on the front lines. Dallaire was, forgive me for saying so, our scapegoat. And for those of you who weren't born before 1994, maybe you're free of guilt here, but the rest of us share some responsibility for what happened there, because certainly I largely slept through the genocide in Rwanda. I knew it was happening, but like most people, and this again comes up in the film and comes up in the autobiography, I was horrified but did nothing. And for Dallaire, that recognition that he could do nothing, even though he was officially charged with trying to save lives, is the fundamental. I mean, he takes it on himself. He regards this as a personal failure, but he also recognizes it as an organizational failure. Last level, still Rwanda. And this is E.O. Wilson. He's an entomologist, teaches at Harvard. He wrote the book Sociobiology, published in 1975, launched a whole field, which we now think of in terms of evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology. So look it up if you don't already. This is a central intellectual trend in conversations these days about what it means to be human. So this is Wilson in the book Consilience on Rwanda, and it's just 2 or 3 paragraphs, but this is a key here. Rwanda is a microcosm of the world. War and civil strife have many causes, most not related directly to environmental stress. But in general, overpopulation and the consequent dwindling of available resources are tinder that people pile up around themselves. So what Wilson is really saying here is that what happened between the Tutsi and the Hutu in Rwanda in 1994 was, yes, about ethnic strife, control of a culture, but it was even more fundamentally about what he refers to in the book as a failure of carrying capacity. And for those of you who study sustainability, who are thinking seriously about climate change and about population growth, this gets at the heart of that argument. So what happened in Rwanda, yes, had to do with politics, had to do with tribal antagonisms, but even more for Wilson, it is about a lack of resources. And a lack of resources generated, recognized, out of the goodwill of Western authorities who improved health outcomes for decades before we got to the genocide, right? So you increase population, water becomes scarce because of the way land is divided among increasing numbers of inheritors of the land. You have lower productivity. And so according to Wilson, the solution is to reduce headcount. And the genocide did that. 10% fewer people at the end of the genocide than at the beginning. Now, I think many of us would look at this and say, I hope not. Right? That when we do these things, World War II, World War I, the war in Kivu now, that it really is about something that's going on in our heads that we could theoretically control. But Wilson is saying it's happening at a far deeper level, and that there are sort of natural responses in which we engage that we need to understand if we hope to correct them. And so when I look at this side by side with what Rusesabagina said, side by side with what Dallaire says, and I think about leadership, and I would argue, if you want to lead effectively, you're going to have to take all three levels into consideration and recognize that any decision you take will have consequences, both emerges from and will have consequences for these three levels. So Rusesabagina, personal and professional values, Dallaire on organizational codes, and Wilson on sustainable systems, what is and what is not sustainable. And you carry it over to the second set, Rusesabagina in the private sector, Dallaire in the public sector, and all three of them, I think, in the civil society sphere. So if we want solutions to the kinds of problems that we see in the genocide in Rwanda or any other war situation, and again, Jackie has referred to this, then we need to be able to think across sectors and across levels. And that's what's going to get us the kind of leadership we want. Having said that, I also recognize that that's really complicated. It's not even complex, which sounds sort of positive. How will you do that, any one of you individually or any group of us as a collective? How do we work across those three levels and in the three sectors to come up with leadership decisions that feel plausible and that will be acceptable to a large constituency which we would want to involve in our decision making? And this takes us to business stories. So the first of all, let me just deal with the business stories, the kinds of business stories we all know. So when you think about, for those of you who have spent time in the business arena, we have business cases. So one that I taught recently, Robin Chase Zipcar and an Inconvenient Truth, is about the woman who founded Zipcar. It was a car rental service that you can rent cars by the hour. You become a member of the group and the cooperative, and you can rent cars at reduced rates. So it's very convenient, and it is a piece of a much bigger phenomenon today, which you will also recognize from the TED Talk that I referred to here. So this is Rachel Botsman, the case for collaborative consumption. We are moving into an era of collaborative consumption, the sharing economy. So you think about Airbnb, Uber, I mean, the list is long. I don't know how many of these organizations operate in Romania, so I know Airbnb does. My guess is you have some form of a car-sharing service. This would be an official, legal, as opposed to the sort of the extra-legal version of this that may have existed previously. So cases, something like a TED Talk, books, Walter Isaacson, the biography of Steve Jobs, which is a huge, huge seller, and that captures a very difficult man. And Isaacson, who is a journalist, spent years at Time magazine, writes in a journalistic style about a man and captures the complicated character who is Steve Jobs in all of his complication. That is the good side, the bad side, the difficult side of Steve Jobs. And finally, something like this blog post that John Fort, who's an online editor for CNBC, did recently on Satya Nadella. Satya Nadella is the CEO at Microsoft, and made the mistake of suggesting on an interview recently that women should not ask for raises, recognizing that there was this income differential, 79 cents on the dollar, men to women, because at least in the tech industry, the system always gets it right. I mean, that was sort of the implication. But John Fort says, no, indeed, it explains the culture in the tech sector, and offers you the slides, the onboarding slides from Netflix, part of the same world, that says, the market will set your salary. So this is not about seniority, it's not about perceived internal value, it's about what would our competitors pay you to lure you away. That we will pay you plus a slight supplement. And I think Nadella's argument was, it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman, that's the way the system works. And he realized pretty quickly that this was, even if he actually thought it, and even if it were true, it was not a good thing to say. And so, right, so this is the press went wild with this, and he backtracked, apologized, right? So, but these are classic business stories, and they are interesting because they capture the real world, the day-to-day operations of businesses and people in business. But there is this other thing, which is a different set of stories that I would argue, and I say here, so you remember the Jim Collins book, Good to Great, I would argue that the business stories to which I just alluded are the good stories, and these are the great stories, and I'll explain why in just a second. But Antigone, anyone in the room read Antigone, Sophocles? Right, so the story of King Creon, right, who steps into his position of authority because the politics have played out that way, there's been a rebellion, and he now has power. But he is ruling over a kingdom, Thebes, that includes Antigone, who is the daughter of the previous king, King Oedipus. And Antigone, so Creon says, one of your brothers is a traitor, and I will not bury him. And Antigone says, I don't care what he did. He's my brother, and the gods insist that we bury the dead. So she goes out and buries the dead, and Creon is then faced with the obligation to eliminate Antigone. And there are political reasons for this as well as simply a question of authority. But this is, going back 2,500 years, the play that says this is what it means to have authority and this is what it means to lead in the face of authority. This is about speaking truth to power. And it started, that phenomenon, the notion of speaking truth to power starts here. It is no less relevant in the 21st century and in the world of business than it was then. The Lives of Others, the German film, Florian Henkel von Donnersmarck, the film about the Stasi official who eavesdrops on a writer, playwright, and his girlfriend, and who discovers that in order to defend the principles for which he thinks the Stasi and the East German state were established, are no longer served by those establishments, but could be served by a personal interest in other people listening. And of course he does this, right, with a set of headphones, and they don't know that they're being listened to. And of course he listens to everything they do. So, he's getting information that I think most of us would regard as private. But the important thing here is that he discovers his own humanity and the possibility of a humane system in the face of systemic authority that has wound up in a very different place. The Queen, Stephen Frears' film about Queen Elizabeth II and Tony Blair faced with the death of Diana and how to deal with it, and so Helen Mirren plays Queen Elizabeth, and she has to come to terms with the fact that someone she hates, and there may be Diana followers in the room, she hates, but she has to eulogize her in order to meet the expectations of the British people. This is about what it means to have a public persona at the same time you have private feelings. Any CEO would understand this. Any leader, forget about, business sector specific, would get this and should get this. Shall We Dance, Japanese film about a salaryman, that's what they call the guys who wear the suits on the Tokyo subways, right, who discovers that his life is empty because he has done everything he was ever told to do and done it right, and now he's 40 and doesn't know what to do with himself. So he starts taking dance lessons, Western ballroom dance lessons, which are deeply sinful from a Japanese perspective. But of course he finds, and this is the wonder of Hollywood, even when it happens in Japan, discovers the wonders of self-expression and leadership in dance and takes that back into the workplace with him. And finally, Walden, reaching back. So the list is alphabetical rather than chronological. Walden, Thoreau, goes out and settles on Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. First chapter of the book is labeled Economy. And he says, this is what we can do. This is the way we can live our lives without getting involved in trade in the negative sense. There is an economy that makes the world go round, but it is about my values and the values of the society. He settles at Walden Pond on July 4th. He claims by accident, but this is clearly a statement about how he thinks America should work as opposed to the way it does work. And so in that spirit, he is trying to remind us that there is a better way. So these stories that I refer to as great business stories, I think what they all do is that they anchor us in the here and now. There's a very specific physical place, a set of time, a plot, characters. They also transcend the boundaries that they set that way by making an example so passionate and so explicit about what is happening in the world that they have created for us that we understand the implications of that world for our own world, so that we can move beyond the boundaries of sector and level and our personal interests in order to apply what we read in these stories to the world that we would like to create. And finally, they defy resolution. That is, if they do it right, they do not provide the silver bullet to a problem that we would like to address. They let us articulate a short-term solution. It works, maybe it works for the longer term, but it also keeps inviting us to go back and redefine. So again, with Jackie, I think it was you talked about the film, and you said, every time I look at this film, I learn something new. And I would argue that any one of the stories that I put up on the screen a couple of minutes ago does that. Every time you go back to Walden, every time you go back to the Queen, every time you go back to Antigone, there's something new to learn, and that keeps you a little bit on edge, a little bit off balance. And that's important because it keeps you from making bad, to use a political term, totalitarian decisions. So, no resolution. That's maybe an uncomfortable note on which to end, so I'm going to offer you a resolution nevertheless, and this is a line from a TED Talk that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie gave several years ago. She's a young Nigerian writer. She comes from an educated family. She grew up in Nigeria, she says, reading stories about little white English kids who eat apples and play in the snow, and so she started writing stories in Nigeria about little white kids who eat apples and play in the snow. And she after a while, figured out that this was probably not capturing the world that she knew and the world that she inhabited, and so she learned to write, learned to tell stories that emerged from the world that she knew. And so the closing line of her TED Talk is this: when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. And I would point out that this links back to the comment I quote from Christian, this recognition of contradictions and differences that you detect in Romania and people who think about Romania and where Romania is today. It is okay to disagree. It is actually productive to come to different conclusions, to recognize difference. But that spirit is the one that I think makes it possible for us, in and out of business, across the sectors, over the levels, to come to conclusions, at least short-term, about what we can do together in order to create a better world. Business does this. It can do this. It is not just about the rapacious CEO. There are a lot of good people in business who do really good things, and they tell really great stories. So if you're looking for a way to think about story, and I recognize that this is not just craft. I mean, Antigone, you could write an Antigone. I wish you well with the undertaking. This is a different caliber of story, right? But they're real and they stay with us. So as we think about story and the power of storytelling, I hope you'll regard this too as a way of getting at the opportunity that storytelling presents. Thank you.